Foremost, want to thank everybody for joining today. As you come in to the webinar, you're going to be muted, and so if you do have questions along the way, we'll ask you to throw those in a chat. If you look on the bottom part of your pane there'll be a chat section or a questions session, and you can put your questions in there, and we'll address them as they come up. So again, thank you for joining. This is the Rice in 2023 Resistance, Best Management Practices and Stewardship webinar. And with us today, we've got Keith Burnell. He's a technical marketing manager with BASF. He covers all of our rice brands. We've got Cade Hayden, who is our tech services representative in the Boot Heel, Missouri, Northeast Arkansas, and Western Tennessee. We have Dr. Jason Norsworthy, Distinguished Professor and Elms Farming Chair of Weed Scientists at the University of Arkansas. And we have Dr. Tommy Butts, Assistant Professor and Extension Weed Scientist, also with the University of Arkansas. And we have Tim Walker, the General Manager of Horizon Ag. So just to introduce myself, my name is Matt Cook. I am the Field Marketing Manager that covers the South region for BASF. And with that, again, remember, if you have any questions along the way, please throw those in the chat. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks again, everybody, for being here today. And obviously, one of the reasons we wanted to have this presentation and have this meeting is to educate growers on best use practices as well as stewardship. Wanted to kind of give a quick overview of some of the things we saw out of last year. We have been notified that there have been 15 different Provisia outcrossings that have been confirmed between Louisiana and a couple in Arkansas. So upon that, we wanted to make sure we're continuing to steward this program and these products, as well as education. So that's one of the reasons why we decided to put this together, this education and webinar. So now what I'd like to do is turn it over to Cade to talk about the Clearfield stewardship practices and best management.
All right, as Matt said, my name is Cade Hayden. If we want to go ahead and roll to the next slide. So yeah, I just wanted to go over the Clearfield guidelines for the Clearfield system. Why are we here? Why do we use products like Clearfield and Provisia systems? It's a lot of it comes back to weedy rice being an annual problem that we have year after year, a long seed bank built up with that weed, and it's hard to control both from a residual standpoint and in conventional systems from a post-emerge standpoint. So just a few guidelines here as far as starting clean, start clean, stay clean mentality. So of course we want to avoid using products that we would use in the crop. So those would be our ME type herbicides, and we really like to start with glyphosate, sharpen, and command behind the drill. That really helps us to lay a good foundation of weed control as far as both the grass and broadleaf perspective. As we move into the season, utilizing the trait enabled herbicides such as Newpath, Beyond, and Clearpath in the Clearfield system. That helps us, as well as a product like Prowl, where we can use delayed pre-emerge for suppression of weedy rice. So from a perspective of a traded crop, Prowl is not going to afford us the level of control that we would have with such a product like Newpath, but Prowl can provide weedy rice suppression. It's a few and far between options as far as weedy rice suppression from a residual standpoint. So we really like to incorporate Prowl into our herbicide programs. We can use Prowl twice throughout the year, so that provides us a good residual. And then spray volume is very important. We like to see 10 gallons early in the season. Once we get a crop up, we'll see better control even when we move to 15. And by air, 5 gallons is a really good option as far as a carrier volume goes. Go ahead to the next slide, please, Matt. So again, getting proper coverage, we can have the best herbicides in the toolbox, but if we don't get the good proper coverage, use the proper adjuvants, we're not doing our best job. So we need a crop oil with our Newpath and Beyond. at a pint or a 1% or 2 pints by air. You know, last year we had all the problems with the drought and we weren't able to control some of the grasses just because they were so hardened off, and we had, you know, very hot conditions. So we hit them small, try to hit actively growing weeds. Again, using different products like Prowl and Command in that rotation, trying to bring in additional residuals besides our Newpath to a clear field system will help us to prolong the use of that system where we still have efficacy with it. Again, something like a ClearPath product where we have both the imazethapyr and the facet in there, as well, you know, we can mix that with the Prowl, then we have 3 modes of action. So that's diminishing the selection pressure that we're going to be putting on our, you know, Clearfield trait-enabled Newpath and beyond. And then there are some antagonistic tank mixes. Sometimes with other ALS chemistries, we can get antagonism with our Newpath and beyond. So we want to avoid any of those negative tank mixes. Next slide, please. As far as, you know, what are some growing practices that we like to see with a Clearfield system? It's not always practical, but if we can flush, if there's no rain in the forecast, we can activate that herbicide. And, you know, as we well found out last year, it's not always possible to get a permanent flood on some of these fields in 2 days, but just having that mindset of making the application and, you know, trying to get that well turned on as soon as possible afterwards, after we do that pre-flood application, will help us to, you know, get our ultimate best weed control in rice, which is the permanent flood. Doing things like, you know, keeping our stewardship up around the edges of the field, trying to clean out, you know, the ditches, the turn roads. That's a very tall task in the middle of summer when we got a lot going on, but it does help to reduce, you know, not just any weedy rice, but, you know, definitely pigweed is a very rampant around our fields. And then, you know, Rogan for escapes, it's not a real popular thing to do, but, you know, if you notice that you have a couple spots out in the field, it will pay dividends to go out there and go ahead and rogue those escapes, as well as, you know, just post-harvest management, rolling those fields, and trying to get promote an environment for germination for our weedy rice to get that up, and then we use Mother Nature to frost kill it to get it killed off. So next slide, please. So one of the biggest things that has led to resistance in the Clearfield system is continuous Clearfield rice, which we'll hear some more about later. But that's one thing that we want to avoid, and we need to incorporate, you know, soybeans into that rotation when we can use products like a Zidua or an Outlook, a Verdict, or a Dual. So it's these Group 15 residuals have excellent activity on weedy rice as well as other grasses. We can also bring in things like glyphosate and you know, glufosinate as far as that goes to control them when they escape through that. So if we don't have soybeans in that rotation, we continue to build that weedy rice seed bank. It will, you know, provide all the options, the few options we have in rice, more challenges to controlling it. So if we can get out of rice for a year and get into a soybean crop, that will help us immensely. Next slide, please. Just a few last guidelines here. So basically, you know, don't grow crawfish following Clearfield rice. Maybe not the biggest thing concern for this area in the North Delta, or at least in my area where I'm at. And just the main takeaway here is not to let anything go to seed if you lay a field out for a year. Just making sure we're either, you know, chemical fallow or doing tillage as far as that goes, and just making sure that we make the most out of, you know, that year we can do, so we can diminish the seed bank. Next slide, please. So what it really boils down to with the Clearfield system is, again, that proper GPA and adjuvant. So if we're running a ground rig, if we can get that water up to 15 gallons, that will help us immensely as far as control goes in that post-emerge application. If we can harvest those weedy fields last, if we know we have a problem, get to that last. I know that's hard to do because it might be on its way down if we have a severe infestation, but if you have to harvest it, just, you know, taking that rainy day to really clean the combine good will go a long ways. Especially the crop rotation, again, that's a huge benefit to us. So we can bring a lot better herbicides in to control the grasses we have in play here. And again, just trying to, follow a good rotation and build out how we need to move forward with this system. Next slide, please. And then finally, this is just our basically our BASF rice herbicide portfolio for the Clearfield system. I did want to bring your attention to one product at the top there that you might not have seen before, called Beyond Extra. So Beyond Extra is a combination of the label of Beyond and Raptor. There's no extra product in that. It's not a premix. It's nothing like that. It's still a 1 pound Mazamox. So we're starting to produce that now. So if you see, Beyond Extra on a recommendation, or your retailer says they have Beyond Extra, just be rest assured that it's the same product as Beyond, and we'll continue to support that how we have. And with that, again, we'll save questions for the end, but I'm going to turn it back over to Keith here to discuss the Provisia system.
Thank you, Kate. Next slide, please. Kate did a real good job of leading into a lot of these points that basically are kind of overlapping. Talking about the Provisia best use management. Obviously, with Provisia, there are other herbicide technologies that have the same basis, if you will, but we want to make sure we're using Provisia herbicide on Provisia rice. Like Kate said, the weed seed bank here is enormous. So when we look at these management plans that Dr. Tommy Butts and Jason Norsworthy will go through here in just a little bit, this is one of the strategies we're looking at. The other thing I think that's extremely important is that when it comes to starting clean, regardless of whether it's rice or soybeans, when we're looking at this ACC herbicide technology, when we think about resistance, we want to make sure that we're avoiding at all costs the use of that class of chemistry in your burn down. Now, there are multiple options for other burn down, as you can see here, glyphosate, sharpen, or other things that Jason and Tommy will talk about. But again, one thing we can do to preserve this chemistry is to avoid using it unless it's used in the crop. We'll talk about that a little bit more again in just a minute. Again, we want to do broad spectrum as best we can. Everything we can put in a tank that does not antagonize, so we can get pre-emergent grass control, as well as put our residuals in there. Use glyphosate as your friend in this situation. Next slide. Again, like Kate said, when it comes to any weed, proper GPA is key. Using a correct adjuvant to make sure that we're maximizing the weed control efficacy of whether it's just Provisia or that tank mixture. Again, we go back to, as we know, Weed Science 101, smaller, actively growing weeds are easy to control. One of the things we have done with the Provisia label is expanded it from a 2-shot program or a 3-application program, as long as we're held within that 31 ounces per year. When we talk about utilizing tank mixes to broad spectrum to create that broader spectrum of weed control, again, like Kate said, there are certain things with Provisia that we have to be aware of that can antagonize or reduce the level of control. Things like propanil, triclopyr, pinoxin, are some of those things that we would potentially avoid putting in the tank at all costs. Again, we want to make sure we're using different modes of action. And in the first case, in the first tank mixture, we'd like to have that tank mix in that first application. Next slide. Again, like Kate said, one of the other things that are not in crop, but how can we help ourselves on the weed edges and the pond edges, is to make sure that those things aren't getting into our fields and or becoming a source of that weedy rice. And at all costs, one of the things is to not let this weedy rice go to seed, regardless of whether that's tillage or chemical management. Next slide. We talked about the 2 and the 3 pass, and I'll let Dr. Tommy and Jason go through this a little bit more, but we have expanded the label to go from a 2-shot program to a 3-shot program. And I think they'll do a really good job of explaining why we feel like that's a really good choice, especially on some of those acres where maybe it takes a lot longer to get that water across the field to get that flow up. Next slide. And again, last couple of slides are really just kind of reiterating the things we talked about before. We want to start clean, want to make sure we're using the product, everything we can, as far as, making sure we're using it right. Volume of water, The last bullet on the very bottom here, a lot of these crops are obviously grown near other grass crops, and we just want to be good stewards of our neighbors as well. Just be cognizant if you got a corn, sorghum, or in certain areas, obviously not here, in South Louisiana, we obviously have sugarcane. So just be cognizant of your neighbors when we're spraying something such as this. Next slide. And again, we want to make sure we're using it on smallest weeds that we can. And we also want to make sure, as the last bullet emphasizes, trying not to use other ACC ACEs in that crop as a burn down, and really just preserve this chemistry as long as we can. Next slide. And again, goes back to one of the things Kate said. It really probably boils down to these 5 things here: proper coverage and adjuvant use to maximize the weed control of the products that are going in the tank, whether it's just straight Provisia or a tank mix of the combinations to broaden that spectrum. If you can, harvest that weedy field last and clean that equipment. Practice crop rotation, and again, control those weeds in those other crops. Next slide. And just like Kate showed, this is a schematic of our Provisia recommendation in rice. And I'm going to let Dr. Tommy Butts and Jason Norsworthy go into a little more explanation of the weed management in these different systems from the Arkansas perspective. Thank you.
With that, I want to talk a little bit about what we're seeing in Arkansas. Dr. Butts and I will kind of go through a few slides here. And this is basically we have tier 2 accessions, what I'm calling accession 7 and accession 8. They were sprayed with Provisia at 15.5 ounces. You can see here a labeled application. It was actually 1 leaf to 2 leaf plants. This is weedy rice that last year or this past winter we confirmed to be resistant to Provisia. If you actually look to the left of the screen, you can see a susceptible check. And unlike, as Keith mentioned earlier, unlike I think Louisiana, where I don't know, there are 13, 14 different confirmed populations they have there. This is really the only location here in Arkansas in which we have one. And really, it's only one location, even though I'm showing this as 2 accessions, because we've got a OND weedy rice and then we have a non-OND weedy rice. Next slide. And when you take a look at this field and how we got into this situation, I really think it begins to set a precedence for the fact that we've got to do things different, and hence the reason for this webinar today. This is a field that's been it's a 0 grade continuous rice field. It's been in continuous clearfield rice since the early days of clearfield rice through about 2018. At that time, because of the failure of the clearfield system, the grower switched over to Provisia rice and has been in Provisia rice since, and that ultimately has led to the failure again of the Provisia technology on weedy rice. One thing that's good to say here is that this field is going to be rotated to soybean in 2023, and one thing that you'll see throughout our portion here, as well as through BASF, I think soybean is a vital component to rotate with and ensure that we don't have a buildup of not only Provisia rice, clearfield rice, any of the technologies that we currently have today in rice.
Hey, Jason, just to chime in here too, a lot of the calls I'll get in these fields are these 0 grade continuous rice. And I get told, and I think you get told all the time too, well, we can't grow soybeans there, right? They're going to die, they're going to flood, we just can't grow a soybean crop there at all. And I think, both you and I have talked to growers that have had to do this, go to soybeans, and they've actually been very, successful still, right? And surprisingly successful in their eyes, but it can really still work even in a 0 grade. Now, is it more challenging? Can you run into the wrong year where you'll get flooded out? Sure. But I think I just wanted to emphasize that this is really feasible, even on 0 grades. We can be successful growing soybeans. We can still get some pretty high yields. I think you had an example of a grower that was still hitting 60, 65 in a 0 grade. So I mean, with our varieties anymore and things like that, there's just our soybeans are pretty highly tolerant to a lot of things. again, I think the word can't do it in a zero grade shouldn't be there. Now, again, it is more challenging, but we can be successful with it.
And along those lines, Tommy, at times also I hear that the growers are very, very receptive maybe of rotating, but there's a landlord that's essentially saying that you're going to plant soybean or you're going to plant rice in this field. And I'd be more than happy to talk with those individuals. If they're going to continue to plant rice and make a profit off of rice, we've got to bring soybean into that rotation. Next slide. So when we look at the Clearfield system, I've got a little schematic here drawn where we start off with planting, and depending on when you plant, it's going to take 21 days to that rice to emerge. And you can see the various growth stages, at least early on in the year. And when I think of a Clearfield system for weedy rice, really the heavy lifting historically has been associated with Newpath, where you're coming in at 1 to 2 leaf growth stage. You're coming back with a subsequent Newpath application, 4 to 5 leaf prior to flooding. As was indicated earlier with Keith and I think also Cade, depending on what type of field you're in, if you're in a zero grade field, most of those guys are going to be able to flood within 2 days. But if it's a single inlet field and I'm having to push water across several hundred acres, it may take as many as 12 days, 14 days in some instances, especially under extreme dry conditions, to flood that field. And the beauty here of the system that I have drawn here is the dark green is the residual activity of Newpath, and I'm still carrying some residual into that flood. I also have where I can come back in post-flood and I can apply beyond. If I did have some weedy rice plants that emerged prior to flood, hopefully I can take those out post-flood, going in advance. Now, a problem that I think we've encountered, and it's really been prevalent within, I'm going to say, the last 4 to 5 years, is I talk to a lot of folks that want to get away from that Newpath. They want the rotation flexibility out of that Clearfield system. And how they put rotation flexibility into that is they begin to look at spraying beyond, 2 shots of beyond. And the problem there is the beyond really just does not have strong residual associated with it. And anything that emerges prior to flood, we have no way of taking it out. And I'll tell you, this scenario right here is if we want to create Clearfield weedy rice, this is a good way of doing it, is rotating to a system where we're spraying 2 applications of beyond. Tommy, any thoughts on that?
No, I would just agree with you there. The other thing to note though too is we just have widespread resistance already to weedy rice in the state. I know you have your screening program every year, and there's a significant amount that comes in that's resistant. And whether it's true red rice or the weedy rice, however you want to break it down, we still have those populations out there, and so we're dealing a lot with that in general anyway, already, which is a battle. I also just want to make a note too, we're specifically talking about weedy rice here, but it's always good to hit on barnyard grass, because that still is a major animal too. And when we're talking the programs there as well, we have the widespread Newpath resistance anymore, and trying to use many modes of action, which I know both Cade and Keith hit on too, right? Moving up command, making sure we're getting command out there on those acres for our barnyard grass, moving facet up in there and using its residual for barnyard grass management. All those kinds of things are big benefits as well from that standpoint. So I just kind of wanted to emphasize, don't look at this as we're living in the Newpath beyond world anymore, because we're not really for either weedy rice or barnyard grass. We need a lot of things in there to battle these weeds anymore.
Next slide. So when I flip to a Provisia system, and again, focus purely on weedy rice here, not necessarily barnyard grass, the programs that we've evaluated historically have been 2 pass programs. And, in research plots, they've looked very impressive. I think Dr. Butts would agree with that in terms of his. And I think, but when you get out in the real world, you get out in the field, and again, it's taking 12 days, 14 days to flood those fields. That's not what we're doing. Our plots, we're flooding 24 hours after we make that Provisia application. And unfortunately, Provisia herbicide does not have any residual activity. So if I go out and spray 2 15.5-ounce applications, at that point, I'm out of Provisia. That system, I believe, is going to fail long-term in these production fields. Go on and advance to the next. You know, I'll be the first to tell you that I have not looked at a 3-pass system, but I do think a 3-pass system makes sense. And what I mean by that is basically starting with 11 ounces in that first application, coming back with 10 ounces in that second application. And for those weedy rice plants that are going to emerge prior to flooding, we've got to have something post-flood that's going to give us an option of controlling those. And really, there's no other tool or technology that's going to provide extremely high levels of control of those weedy rice plants other than Provisia. Now, with that, though, go on advance. I also believe, go on advance the slide. I also believe that there is value, though, of putting some residuals. I think Cade mentioned Prowl earlier. I'm a big fan of Prowl Bolero. At times, I'll see 35–40% reduction in weedy rice from just the residual of Prowl and Bolero. He mentioned Rogue from the standpoint of actually physically roguing weeds out of rice, but Rogue herbicide, especially on zero-grade ground or side inlet ground, Rogue herbicide has activity on weedy rice. And in the plot work we've done, it really brings value to that Provisia system, having that Rogue in there just to provide another level of protection. And if you're in a system, we've got to, rice system, we've got to make sure that we're protecting these technologies long term. Any other thoughts there, Tony?
The main thing I just point out there is, and it's not fun for us to say because it's not an easy button, right? It's not Newpath and Beyond was an easy button. Like that was great, a great system for a long time. And really, we don't have that easy button anymore. And this is going to be it's going to be a challenge moving forward completely, right? So like you mentioned, Prowl and Bolero can help. It's not a home run hitter. You know, Rogue can help, not necessarily a home run hitter. We're in the Provisia system, which is really good, but without any residual there, also has its weak point there. And so it's packaging all of this together to really battle this problem. Otherwise, we end up with the mess like we saw in the field where we confirmed this resistance in already. It's just that's where it goes to if we don't try and package all of these things into one management strategy. So
next slide. So with that, I've kind of thought about weedy rice and I think about barnyard grass. And if I'm one of the rare individuals in the state of Arkansas that have susceptible barnyard grass to the ALS chemistry, I've got susceptible weedy rice to the ALS chemistry, or if I have weedy rice that's susceptible to Newpath and I've got ALS resistance, Newpath Beyond resistance in my barnyard grass, I think you potentially have the scenarios, rotation scenarios that I have listed here. And it's basically a system where you're rotating, you're following soybean with Provisia. You can go from Provisia to Clearfield. I have options for controlling Newpath and Beyond resistant barnyard grass in a Clearfield system. There's plenty of tools out there. If those tools are not available, I mean, maybe things are different, but I've got a 3-year rotation here that I would recommend that we follow if I have a scenario like this. Advance the slide. If I'm in a system where I have weedy rice that is resistant to Newpath and Beyond, and Tommy alluded to here just a few moments ago, the survey that I've conducted over the last 2 years, the weedy rice samples that came in, 44, I believe it was, out of the 45 samples that got submitted were resistant to the Clearfield technology, that being, again, Newpath and Beyond. And if you're in a scenario like that, I really think you're looking at soybean, following that with Provisia. Because of the risk of having a Provisia off type, I would recommend rotating back to soybean if you're wanting to protect that Provisia technology long term.
So I got a couple questions for you quick while we're here, Jason. So one thing is I get asked a lot, with the screening program, right? We screen everything from a post-emergence perspective, basically, other than chromosome. So I know with Facet, one of our big recommendations is moving it up and use the residual activity, because even if we have resistance post, we still see residual activity out of it, which is great, especially with command. On the Newpath side of things, if we have resistance post, do we still get residual activity out of that? if we would move it up front, or is it because of the ALS resistance, it's resistant both ways?
That's a good question, Tommy. And what I would tell you is based on the plot work we've done thus far, I would tell you, you get absolutely no activity on Clearfield resistant weedy rice. When we've looked at using 6 ounces of Newpath at planting, and basically those plots look very similar to my non-treated check in the plot work we've done.
And I would assume that's the same with Barnyardgrass, right? I mean, it's
that is, you know, with Barnyardgrass, I probably slightly more so with weedy rice than with Barnyardgrass, but even Barnyardgrass, yeah, you might can differentiate them from the non-treated check, but it's not that, you know, with Facet, we start getting 2 weeks, 14 days of residual control. You're not getting that with Newpath on a resistant biotype.
Okay. The other thing I was just going to ask here, you know, like for our population we talked about earlier that now is, you know, Provisia-resistant, and I think you mentioned it, or maybe Keith mentioned it, but, you know, it's also Clearfield resistant, right? It's got so it's got both traits in it. It's resistant to both. You know, we're looking at our rotation factor here. If we have resistance to, you know, kind of just one of those, if we lose both of those, you know, what's your next recommendation for trying to really manage both Provisia and Clearfield resistance in the same population?
Well, I think where you have Provisia resistance in Clearfield, I mean, the grower, for instance, in the example I gave, he doesn't have a choice. I mean, he may have not wanted to rotate to soybean. His landlord may have told him not to rotate to soybean, but that is not an option at this point, because essentially the Clearfield technology as well as the Provisia technology has failed. And I guess I will go on and also just there's some other technologies out there that are comparable to the Clearfield and the Provisia system. And I will also just state that those are not an option to rotate to at this point.
Yeah, and I think that's really just what I wanted to highlight there is, like, if we get ourselves backed into that corner, there is no option. And it's depressing to say that, you know, as a weed scientist and just an agricultural enthusiast in general, that there is no options. But I mean, that's where we're at. Like, if we get both of those, and so protecting these as much as possible at all costs, you know, again, trying to rotate to soybeans, even if it is a 0 grade, you know, as long as it's not a landowner issue, or even if it is a landowner issue, let's try and have some sort of discussion, because it's just gonna ruin the system so fast if we can't do that. So,
next slide. Here, I just wanted to touch on barnyard grass. We've used a lot of rice star. We've used a lot of clincher over the years. And as a result of that, we do see failure of those herbicides. We've done some work in the greenhouse looking at some of these, what I call ACCase resistant barnyard grass populations. This was a 2-leaf barnyard grass sample here. It is resistant to clincher. It is resistant to rice star. You know, we did get control of this in the greenhouse with Provisia, but I do think if we look at a 6-leaf application, probably Provisia at a 1x rate would fail, especially in the field. And I guess my point here is we've got to also think about barnyard grass and how we can minimize the selection with Provisia. And Tommy, you've already touched on it. I mean, it all starts, as far as I'm concerned, it all starts with clomazone. That needs to be on every acre to really help protect the Provisia. I like to see a residual in that first application of Provisia. I think that was mentioned by Keith earlier. And I'm really not opposed at times. If it's going to take me, again, that 12 to 14 days to get water across the field, I'm probably going to have something in that second post to try to lay down again some additional residual. And at the end of the day, we've got to minimize the selection on the Provisia herbicide.
No, I 100% agree. And like you said, I think we can play some games with those residuals. I mean, it depends a little bit on soil type. Clay soils get really hard to play games because we have to max out rates on everything. But if you're on a silt loam, I mean, you can, you know, play games with split applications of clomazone. You can add the Prowl and Boleros in there. You know, maybe we do, you know, well, for Provisia, we can't use Newpath, but if we're in the Clearfield system, maybe we still get a little bit out of the Newpath on some things. You know, so there's a lot of options there that we can, you know, pick and choose and pick some tank mix partners, adding in the Facet for the residual standpoint. You know, there's a lot of good things we can do there, and mixing and matching is a great way to kind of attack it. But it just, again, it requires multiple modes of action, multiple herbicides. We can't just hit on the same one. And the one other thing I would emphasize here is, a lot of times and I've tried to hit on this a lot of county production meetings and things, but a lot of people tell me, well, it gets so expensive to, pack 2 or 3 residuals in each one of these applications and things like that. And I mean, I can tell you from our research trials and from talking to growers, the more you pack residuals in at the end of the year, the more economical the whole herbicide program was compared to if you have to rely on, multiple post applications, salvage treatments, everything else. Those get way more expensive at the end of the year than throwing in an extra residual and having more consistent control, early. So I just always like to emphasize that too. The more we can get those out, the more we can hammer stuff before it ever gets out of the ground, the better off our pocketbook will be at the end of the year, plus our overall yields and weed control efforts. So
timing is what I would have to say with that. I know the Provisia label actually has 6-leaf barnyard grass on it, but I would tell folks, do not wait to 6-leaf to start trying to control barnyard grass, because if you have a failure at that point, now you're definitely in a salvage situation, or again, if you're unable to get it sprayed timely, you're going to be in a salvage situation. So with that, next slide. Just want to kind of close our portion with some additional thoughts. I get questions all the time. Folks ask me, well, I was in Provisia this year. I'm thinking about switching over to Max Ace, and I'm going to do something different next year. I'm going to switch to Max Ace, or I've been in Max Ace and I'm going to switch to Provisia. We do not recommend that. Again, at the end of the day, quizalofop is the herbicide that's being sprayed in that. You're doing nothing to reduce your risk of resistance. The same thing runs for Newpath and Preface. Folks have switched from Clearfield rice over to full page rice, wanting to spray Preface and Postscript. That is not a solution to this problem. And then secondly, lastly, the other thing I will mention is the Provisia herbicide does not have a safener in it. When we look at High Card has a safener in it because if you don't have a safener, you will severely injure, if not kill, the Max Ace rice. So do not spray Provisia over the top of Max Ace rice. But that safener, in addition to safening it on the crop, it also provides a degree of safety to weedy rice, to barnyard grass, and hence that herbicide is not going to have the same level of effectiveness as a Provisia herbicide would. Tommy, any thoughts on that?
no, I mean, and that hits on the point, exactly. And I will say, for anybody with concerns, like High Card in that system is still, still very good, but the power of the sequentials there are so much more necessary than in Provisia. And I will say, if you're where it's gonna break first, it's gonna break first where you have the safener, because it's that little bit less effective, right? And every time we add up these little things going against us, I know Cade mentioned the weather last year and how hardened off weeds were, drought stricken, everything else. You got that going against you. If you got a bad application, you got that going against you. And all of a sudden, if you add in just that little bit less because of the safener, it's another strike against you, right? And so just make a note that, again, that system can be very effective, but it's just one of those extra things to take note of and be aware, because it's one extra possibility that might go wrong.
Okay.
Perfect. And with that, we're going to turn it over to Tim Walker.
Thank you, Matt. It's been a pleasure to be involved in this panel. Not a lot of comments other than the fact, and I think Dr. Butts and Dr. Norrisworthy did a good job talking about the two systems that are out there that are, the Clearfield being compared to full page, Provisia being compared to Max Ace. And so from the standpoint of Provisia rice, the Provisia rice varietal offerings that we bring to the table at Horizon Ag are PVL03 this year, and we are excited about PVL04, a variety that has been developed by the University of Arkansas. It's growing in Puerto Rico now, and we will have a soft launch of that particular variety next year. Clearfield, as you can see, we have a number of varieties, but probably our more popular varieties up north this year will be the CLL 16. We do have a limited amount of CLL 18 that will be out in 2023 that we're excited about. A new variety called CLL 19 is coming next year. It gives us a bit better option on that semi-dwarf early maturing variety. We kind of moved away from, we did move away from the semi-dwarfs in 16 and 18. They are a little bit longer maturing varieties, but the yield potential has been outstanding for CLL 16 and CLL 18. And what the data suggests is that CLL 19 will have yields that rival the 16 and 18, but being a semi-dwarf package with a bit earlier maturing. CLM 04 has certainly been very popular this year. We've been sold out of CLM 04 even after having doubled our seed from what we sold last year. That particular variety went really, really quick. We are excited to have an offering in the aromatic. We import a tremendous amount of rice into the United States every year. And, you know, a lot of the imports are of the aromatic type. And so the CLJ01 has really grown in recent years, really during the COVID situation, probably helped us get a foot in the door with that, and it has continued to expand over the past couple of years. Some of our legacy type varieties, 111, 151, 153, still are out there on you know, very specific uses, and then a high amylose type that is helping us in the export market as we continue to fight a lot of South American rice coming into traditional markets that the United States has had. That variety has really filled a bit of a niche there. So again, we greatly appreciate all of the support for Horizon branded Clearfield and Provisia varieties, and thank you to the panel for allowing me to participate.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. Truly appreciated. I just had so there are no questions in the chat. And I guess before I turn it to the next slide where you'll be able to scan for your CEU credits, I do have a couple of questions. So who should we contact if we suspect resistance in one of our fields? So if I'm a grower and I suspect I have resistance, what's my next step? Anybody on the panel?
I guess I'll take that one. One of the things is obviously we're going to be catching up with your local sales rep. Will be the first person to contact, as well as if you're in Arkansas, obviously you see Mr. Cade there. We will basically get samples of that, and we will take it from there. So basically talk with your BR or salesperson or your technical service rep.
I would also add to that again, the Arkansas Rice Promotion Board provides some support for us to run screenings, Barnyardgrass, Weedy rice. And so if you have a sample that, again, a field that has failed on Weedy rice, collect a seed sample, call your county agent, have your county agent come out, collect a seed sample. They'll get that sent in to me, and then I will get that tested. Not only will I test it for Provisia, but I'll also test it for I'll test it for Clearfield. I'll look at sensitivity to rogue, and get that information back to the growers prior to the following planting season.
Perfect. One other question that came in here. So are there any specific ACCA's herbicides that we should use in Arkansas in our soybean rotation to control grass during the non-rice year to prolong Provisia technology?
Well, in terms of, I mean, again, ACCAs, you know, I think Kate or Keith touched on that. I would definitely stay away from the FOPs, fluazafop, obviously quizalafop, and there's a lot of quizalafop products that are available today. There's a lot of generics out there as it relates. I definitely would stay away from those. I think at the end of the day, glyphosate by far is your best option for managing weedy rice in soybean. And not only that is, I think as mentioned, you've got Zidua, you have Dual, you have what we call the group 15 herbicides. They're extremely, extremely stout on weedy rice from a residual standpoint. And that's where I would focus. I would stay, it's going to be a hard sell to tell me that you need to be using an ACCase herbicide in soybean.
Hey, Jason, just to add to that too, because I don't think we mentioned it when we were talking about the Provisia-resistant weedy rice, and not that like if you're using, say clethodim in your soybean year that you're going to evolve the FOP resistance, and also Quizal FOP won't work. But do you want to hit on the fact where we did have this Quizal FOP resistant rice, and that it seems like
Yes.
clethodim is at least starting to lack on
That's
it?
right. So as Dr. Butts indicated, so I went and I took this Provisia-resistant weedy rice that we have. I looked at the sensitivity to glyphosate, extremely effective. Looked at other FOPs, again, these FOPs that we were talking about using in soybean, for instance, things like fluazafop, no activity there. We looked at clethodim, which again would be Select Max. Select Max was, I would say, partial control at best. It killed about 50% of the plants, half of the plants survived. That is not a good option in soybeans. So again, stay away from things like post herbicide, Post Plus, Select Max, Arrow. There's a lot of clethodim products out there. I would not recommend those, because if you're coming out of Provisia rice and that trait has moved over to that weedy rice, at least the data that we have right now, again, we don't have any field data where we've had multiple applications, but just one application in the greenhouse, it appears that that's not very effective.
I would emphasize there though, in a greenhouse, we normally get much better control. And so if we're only getting 50 or 60% control in the greenhouse, in the field, when we got a lot of other stuff that can go wrong against us, I'm betting we'd be lucky to get 35, percent control there. So that's probably a best case scenario, seeing that out of the greenhouse.
Okay. And last question that we've got here, are there any technologies coming out that could help us in the fight against weedy rice? And I guess a follow-up to that would be, if there is, what would be your recommended use as far as tank mix partners and things like that?
There are things in the pipeline, and I'm not touching. I mean, yes, there are things in the pipeline, and I think we just need to leave it at that at this point. I don't think anything. So my response to that question is there's not going to be anything here in the near future, and I'm talking about the next 2 to 3 years, that's going to solve this weedy rice problem. And based on what we saw in 2022, we're going to have to do some things drastically different for us to get to 3 years, 4 years. And I really think several of these technologies, we're talking probably 5, 6, 7 years to making it to market at best. And so I think the focus needs to be on preserving what we have today.
Yeah, no, I appreciate the feedback, and appreciate the participation. Thank you, Jason, Tim, Keith, Cade, and Tommy. Really appreciate it. You'll see on this next slide here. So if you have your phone handy, just scan this QR code with your mobile device, and it should automatically log you in to receive your CEU credit immediately. And one other thing I wanted to note here, as you log off and you're logging in to get your CEU credits, is that if you'll be receiving a follow-up email from the GoToWebinar folks, and there'll be a survey on there, just a quick survey. It'll take you 2 minutes to fill the survey out, and we'd love to send all the participants a thank you gift. So again, be on the lookout for that survey email coming out. Be sure to check your junk mail just in case it falls in there. But again, thank you to everybody that participated today. And if you have any other follow-up questions, contact anybody at the university or any of your BASF contacts or any of your folks over there at Horizon Ag. So thank you again. Appreciate it. Have a great day.
Thank y'all.